Good morning. I'm Darrell West, Vice President of Government Studies and Director of the Center for Technology Innovation here at the Brookings Institution. And I'd like to welcome you to our 7th annual Alfred Taubman Forum on Public Policy. And we are webcasting this event live, so we'd also like to welcome our viewers from around the country. And we will be archiving the video for this event, so any of you who would like to view this afterwards will have an opportunity to do so through the brookings.edu website. We also welcome any comments or suggestions and questions that you have. We've set up a Twitter feed with hashtag charter schools. That's hashtag charter schools. So if you wish to post any comments during the forum, you are welcome to do so. And sometimes the online discussion is as interesting as the discussion that we take place here today as well. So last year, Mr. Taubman, the sponsor of this event, passed away at the age of 91, and we would like to thank his family for their generous support, and we're very grateful for all that they have done and continue to do. And one of Mr. Taubman's top interests was education. He became very involved with the charter school movement in 1980 when he founded the Michigan Partnership for New Education. And the partnership's goal was to improve the way K-12 teachers were being trained. He later supported Michigan's first charter school, which opened in 1994. And then in 1996, he co-founded the Leora Group, which is a charter school company. And today, that company operates 60 charter schools in Michigan, Arizona, Indiana, Ohio, and Florida. So we thought it was fitting several decades later to see how charter schools are doing. What are they doing well, and what are they doing poorly? What adjustments need to be made, and what role should they play going forward in American education? So today, we are bringing together a diverse set of experts to discuss these topics. We have 3 panels that will cover various aspects of charter schools. So our first panel will discuss the past, present, and future of charter schools. That will be followed by a discussion of the charter school effect on education. And then we will close with a conversation between Brookings Senior Fellow Bill Galston and former Secretary of Education Arne Duncan about charter schools. And by the way, Secretary Duncan has just joined our Brown Center for Educational Policy at Brookings as a non-resident senior fellow, and he will be writing for us and participating in various events. So to moderate the first session, I want to introduce my colleague, Mike Hansen. Mike is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings and also the deputy director of the Brown Center. He is a leading expert on school reform, teacher quality, and education policy. So I will turn the discussion over to Mike.
Thank you, Darrell. Of charter schools. The first charter school law was enacted in Minnesota in 1991, and those doing the calculations will realize that this marks the 25th anniversary of that enactment. So it's a good time to look retrospectively at what we have learned from that experience and what we can learn moving forward as we move forward into the future with charter schools. During these past 25 years, the concept of what a charter school is and how it serves its students has also evolved over time. So from early ideas of teacher-led schools, unfettered by bureaucratic burdens, to today's manifestation of charters being set up as college prep success academies for urban youth, this definition of charter schools has proved to be a fluid concept over time. And consequently, a diverse range of people have endorsed the idea of charter schools over the years. And interestingly, because charters are so different, some who have endorsed charters on one hand also are critics in other cases. And so this sets up an interesting conversation, and we hope that during this debate we can perhaps see some of those different perspectives. During these 25 years, laws have been passed enacting charter schools in a total of 43 states, plus the District of Columbia, and now roughly 2.5 million students are now enrolled in charter schools, about 6.5% of school-age children, including my 3 kids. So, and we have currently we have 6,400 unique charter schools serving youth throughout the country. Under these enrollment figures, though, there are new and emerging issues as charter schools become mature schools in some cities, or even begin to claim significant shares of students from the traditional public school sector. Our first panel will discuss this history, where charters sit now, and future dilemmas that may shape charters and their oversight in the years ahead. And so on this panel, I am joined by, first, John Vallant, furthest away from me. John is a postdoctoral fellow at in the Tulane University Department of Economics, and he is also working at the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans, where he studies the city's school reforms after Hurricane Katrina. Next, I am joined by Dr. Howard Fuller. Howard Fuller, he is a distinguished professor of education and the founder and director of the Institute for the Transformation of Learning at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Prior to his appointment at Marquette, Dr. Fuller served as the superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools from 1991 to 1995, and that which was in the early days of charter schools there in Wisconsin. And finally, to my immediate left, we have Nina Reese. Nina Reese is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, the leading nonprofit education committed to advancing charter school movement. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and hop into this conversation. First, I'm going to turn to John. John, I know some of your recent work has an element where you have looked at the research and the expansion of charter schools over time. And so I'd like you to provide a little overview of what the charter school looks like, how it's grown to its current position, and where you expect charters to go in the future.
Sure. So thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming. So as Mike said, we're 25 years in, and after 25 years, we're at somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million students now in charter schools in the U.S., which is about 6 to 7% of the country. And on one hand, that sounds like a lot of kids, and it is a lot of kids. That's 3 million kids who are being educated in charter schools. On the other hand, that's 94% of public school students who are in a traditional public school or a magnet school or not in a charter. And it's certainly not the case that 6% is spread uniformly across the population and across the country. So there are some states where that percentage is much, much higher. So in Arizona and Louisiana, we're seeing 10% and more. There are states in which it's zero, states that don't have charter laws. And so one thing to always keep in mind with charter schools is that the state is an important player and state policy matters a great deal. But probably the most important divide, both with respect to the effects we're seeing from charters and then also to where we're seeing them, is urban versus non-urban charters. So when it comes to large cities, to keep throwing a few numbers at you, it's about 15% of public school students. It's approaching 15% of public school students are currently in a charter, which compares to about 2% for rural areas. So we're seeing a much greater presence in urban areas, and we're seeing more positive effects on test scores for students in urban areas. Nina's organization, the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, puts out a very nice report every year or so on these market shares and sort of how many students are attending charters. And as you look across some of the biggest cities in the country, it's pretty striking, some of these numbers. So, for example, New Orleans is an outlier, but in New Orleans, 93% of public school students are currently attending a charter. But then in other cities, too, you have Detroit at 53%, D.C. is at 44%, Philadelphia 33%, and Los Angeles 23%. And when you look at trends over time, both in these cities that have sort of a lot of charters and a lot of students who are in charters, and then just more generally at some of the biggest cities in the country, one feature that's striking about the growth is that it has been gradual and sort of linear and has just sort of progressed over time. So you see this 1 to 2 percentage point march up year after year in a lot of these cities in charter enrollment. And actually, more generally in the country, the growth of charter schools and the number of kids educated in charter schools has been very linear. And so I think one of the implications of that is that I'm not sure we've hit a sort of clear equilibrium point in a lot of districts where charters are settling in to be a 10% player, a 20% player, where they have their role and districts know what to make of them and what their enrollment will look like for a long time. We haven't really hit that point. We also haven't really seen what a tipping point might look like, where when charters are educating some number of students, some percentage of students, whether there are implications for a district where the district will sort of move in the direction of New Orleans. So New Orleans right now has no residentially based school assignment. So all families request schools and they're assigned through a centralized enrollment system. And we're still sort of feeling out what that looks like and how you get to that point. It's the case that charters serve more, percentage-wise, serve more Black and Latino students than traditional public schools. They serve fewer students with special needs in general than traditional public schools. And then going forward, so it's difficult to tell. It may be that where there is this linear growth, where it looks like we're getting about 400 new charter schools every year, and maybe 100,000 to 200,000 more students every year who are in charters, there maybe has been a bit of an uptick over the last couple of years. So we might expect a little bit more growth coming soon, and some of that is structural. So we've had caps on charter enrollment, and some of those, there's been a lot of work on those caps, in part in response to Race to the Top. So there's been some work on caps and lifting and eliminating caps. The other reason why there may be more room to grow now is that the politics have shifted around charter schools a bit. So early, it was the support for charters very much tracked the support for vouchers, and that is no longer the case. So now, if you look at sort of surveys and polls and what people think about charter schools, you see about 2/3 support the idea of charters and about 2/3 oppose the idea of vouchers. So there may be more room to work in charters going forward.
Great, thank you, John. I appreciate those comments. Now let's move to Howard. Howard, can you tell us about your involvement with charter schools as superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools in the early 1990s? What did you see as the real innovation of charter schools when they were being established? And in your view, have charter schools lived up to expectations?
Yeah, okay, so I was back there, back in the old days, I guess you call it. And, as a superintendent, I supported charters because I wanted to try to figure out ways to be innovative in the district. And I saw charters as a way to bring in innovation. Because to me, the innovation of charters is not the schools themselves, it's the new way to create public schools. And so back then, I saw that as a way to try to create new types of public schools, to bring in a change dynamic, because I never believed, and I don't believe now, that districts change based on their own volition. I think there needs to be outside pressures. I think there needs to be ways to stir the pot inside the district. And so as a superintendent, I saw charter schools as a way to do that. There's a debate as to when the first national meeting was, and I don't know we'll ever solve that debate. I mean, I believe it was in Roy Romer's mansion in Colorado. There was 37 of us there. And even back then, my argument was, we're the Black people. And that's still my argument. And because to me, it isn't just that schools are educational institutions, which they are. They're also economic institutions. They're also institutions that help define a community. And the one thing that concerns me about the charter movement, if it is a movement, going forward, is the fact that it's the only social movement that I'm aware of where the people who are being most impacted don't lead it. And that remains a significant problem for me. And so when you ask the question, have charters met, whatever expectations I had back then, I would say yes and no. I would say that what charters have done is to put to bed the lie that you cannot educate kids who are poor, that it's not possible to have academic excellence for poor children. And there's a generation of people sitting in this room who may not know that there ever was an argument that you couldn't do that. But there was an argument that you couldn't do that. And charters were real critical to trying to eliminate that lie in American society. And so I'm forever grateful for people who have come forward, whether it's the CMOs like KIP or Spire, Achievement First, or Friendship, but also just people who created one-off schools in communities. And they weren't trying to be a CMO. They weren't trying to create a new form. They just wanted to create a great school in their community to serve kids. And so I think that has happened. But I do think, and I'll stop that, we still have a lot of work to do on the question of the empowerment of Black and brown people and other people of color when it comes to who runs these schools and who's defining like the role that these schools will play in their communities.
Great. Thank you, Howard, for sharing your views. And now, Nina, I'm going to turn to you. Your organization represents a broad array of charter schools. Can you tell us a little bit about the diversity of what you're seeing across charter schools? What do parents want? What do educators want? And what do policymakers want? And do these various interests overlap, or are they at odds at times?
Like the good catch-all question at the end. So just to piggyback on what Howard said, roughly 60% of charter schools are operated by a single site operator. These are individuals who just want to run one school. They may want to open a high school if they started as an elementary school, but they are not interested in scaling their programs. Right now, about 20% of charter schools are run by charter management organizations. The largest charter management organization is KIP, and it has roughly about 144 schools. So it's scaling, but it's not scaling as rapidly as anything in the private sector, perhaps, would scale at this point. And then 12% of the market is occupied by for-profits. And a lot of these for-profits also include online providers. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end. And to the extent charter schools are meeting the needs of homeschooled families, they're also part of this family. So our organization is an alliance. We're actually not a membership organization, but we are constantly trying to kind of straddle the line between representing the interest of all these different factions and making sure that at the end of the day, we're creating a climate in which high-quality charter schools can actually take root. We do that in three ways. We advocate for more funding at the federal level to create charter schools. The federal government has been one of charter schools' greatest friends, so to speak, since the mid-90s, thanks to Bill Clinton. There's a program called the Charter Schools Program, which sends startup dollars to new startups to launch a school. $3 billion has been poured into this program since the mid-90s. And at the state level, we work with states to make sure that they're creating laws that allow for this funding to be leveraged. And you mentioned laws. A lot of people forget that state legislatures and the regulatory climate in which charters operate is actually extremely important in attracting innovation, in making sure that there is enough funding on an equitable in an equitable way for charter schools. Charter schools currently only receive about 70 cents of every dollar that follows students to a traditional school, and that number varies greatly depending on the state that you're in. In states like Ohio, it can be as low as 50 cents to the dollar, which is not good if you're talking about scaling and sustainability. And then the last piece of the puzzle for us is autonomy. This concept was rooted in the fact that you have to make sure that you're giving educators a lot of freedom and autonomy to operate their schools in exchange for raising student achievement. And in some communities, we're not really honoring that the way we should be. And some of these rules are coming from states, others are coming from districts, but some of them, quite frankly, are coming from our authorizers who are trying to make sure that they're creating, safeguarding against bad charter schools from launching, and also to the extent something bad happens, they're coming up with a lot of rules to avoid bad things from happening again. So with that, I'll tell you really quickly about parents, educators, and policymakers. I would say for parents, the key thing they look for when they select a charter school, is this going to be a good fit for my child, right? And studies show that most of them are attracted to charter schools because of their size, because of safety issues, smaller class sizes. So the behavior is no different than those of us who are able to pick a public school of our choice or a private school would make a decision. We base it on the quality of the leadership of the school and these other factors. For educators, It's been interesting. Michael Milkey, I'm going to use him as an example. He's with Noble Network of Charters in Chicago, which is a high-performing high school network in Chicago. He left the traditional system to start a charter school, and a lot of individuals did just that. They wanted an opportunity to start a school, to come up with new ways of teaching, to have greater autonomy, to hire high-quality teachers, to expand the school day and school year and do experiments, so to speak. So in that sense, for a lot of teachers and educators who are attracted to this space, it is about having the autonomy to run your own enterprise, and the level of satisfaction varies depending on the community that you're in, but that is a highly rewarding value proposition for us as a movement, to tell people you have an opportunity to start your own school, you have the autonomy to run that school. I don't know that a lot of these educators sometimes know even what a charter school is, whether, there are a lot of things that we need to do a better job at as a movement, but I would say for educators it is about autonomy and experimentation. For policymakers, it really, I would say it's about impact more than anything else, and it depends on whether you're talking to a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, they're all coming at this from very different points of views, but I think for us as an advocacy organization, it's very important to go in with stories, but also with data points to make sure that they understand the actual impact of charter schools on academic achievement, on equity, and on innovation. So I don't know. That last question, we can talk about it a little bit more, but yeah, that's how it all comes together.
Great, thank you, Nina. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions here, and I'll direct them to individuals, but then, of course, we can have open conversation afterwards. First, I'm going to direct this one to you, Howard. John described charter schools as being most concentrated in urban centers and being disproportionately of service to Black and Hispanic youth. And yet you've also raised this criticism of not being represented. What are some solutions, perhaps, that you see moving forward to help reconcile these racial issues, these tensions within charter schools? Do you see any way forward here?
Okay, I want to make sure I'm really, clear on what I was saying, because the reason why you see the concentration where it is because for those of us who start fighting for this, that's where we saw the greatest problems, was in low-income communities serving people of color. I mean, as a superintendent, I was clear that my district was not serving the children of my city well, and that we needed to have new ideas and new ways of trying to serve those kids. So when people start talking about the fact that, these schools are serving mostly low-income children of color, that makes sense because it's low-income children of color who are suffering the most in this country. That's not to say that there are not low-income children in rural areas that have issues. It's different. And so the charter school movement immediately starts serving those areas where there was like the greatest need. What I'm talking about is that I heard what Nina said about the 60% of the people are in one-off schools. I chair the board of a one-off school every day, dealing with the reality of how do we serve these 280 low-income Black children. And the reality of it is there are networks that have high network people serving on their board who have access to more dollars and more resources than a school like mine does. And people can talk to me about the numbers, but when I look at the differential in the power that exists between the new forms of organization, which I'm not against, and just the one-off schools, what we're facing in the charter movement in certain cities are tiers where you have the schools that have high network individuals are able to generate more money than just the money that comes from the state so that they can better serve kids. And then you have these schools who don't have those high network individuals, don't have people who are going to write big checks for them, and it is more difficult for us to serve the kids well because of the way that the funding mechanisms are set up in certain places for charter schools. And therefore, we have the need for extramural dollars. But the third point I'm trying to make is that if you look at the advocacy organizations that serve our movement, if it is a movement, and you look at the largest CMOs that have the greatest impact, they're all run by white people. And I'm just saying, they are. And I'm not, when I say that, people get all, why are you raising that? I'm raising it because we have to see it. And we have to see that as a problem. Because ultimately, what you don't want charter schools and networks of charter schools to become is the district that we ran away from. And so the issue is not only how do we make sure that kids get a great education, which is paramount, right? The second part of that is how do we make sure that the people whose children these are in a position to define what happens to those children. And I'm not saying that just to make an argument. I'm saying it because I deeply believe that it is a moral issue that the charter effort has to face. And I'm never going to not say it because it has to be said. And ultimately, we have to do something about it. We can't just keep saying it. People talk about diversity. Diversity is fantastic, but diversity without power is an illusion. We talk about engagement. We're going to engage the community. Engagement is we decide to build a bridge in your community and then ask you, what color would you like it to be? Power is deciding that you're going to build the bridge. And what I'm trying to get at is there has to be more empowerment of people of color in this movement.
Thank you, Howard. Nina, do you have a response? Oh, not a direct response, but what do you think about what are you seeing happening in your alliance in terms of racial issues and oversight of different charter schools?
We actually just flew in a number of leaders of color in our community to meet with members of Congress recently, and one of the things that we've been trying to do is shine a light on those high-performing networks or schools that are operated by minorities and try to have a discussion with them about what they need and how we can best help them. I'll go back to one of the things that we advocate for at the National Alliance, which is fiscal equity. I think it's extremely important that we really focus on this issue because if the district is getting more funding, and they already have competitive advantages, the economies of scale, they'll be able to attract more teachers, they'll be able to do a whole host of things to make it very hard for a charter school to operate. I'll cite Houston as an example. Just a couple of years ago when Terry Greer was the superintendent, this was supposedly a charter-friendly superintendent. He ended up hosting one of his teacher recruitment sessions right before the beginning of the school year at a time when it was very difficult for charter schools to compete with the district, and he ended up offering salaries that were much greater in his district than what charters could offer. I mean, when you do things like that, your intent is really to cut the charters at the knee, so to speak, and he was able to recruit a lot of our teachers as a result. I mean, that's just one example. So fighting for fiscal equity, making sure that our students are getting the same amount of money, and more importantly, that there are facilities funding sources available is very important. Most per pupil allocation dollars don't include facilities finance, so we've been arguing for federal incentives to bake facilities finance in the per pupil allocation, and also working with states to make sure that they have some funding stream or something in place so that charter schools are not left to on their own to be able to go and access facilities and to make up the gap through philanthropy. I think if the more we do that, the more the more we'll be able to level the playing field. The other thing I would just mention is we have roughly about 2 million students who've now graduated from charter schools. Where they are, what they're doing is really important. One of the things we're trying to do is identify what's happened to them. And I agree with you that the movement needs to be comprised of the people that we're representing, but I think those who have benefited from charter schools perhaps have the greatest opportunity to come back, make the case, and hopefully start charter schools and run them because they have actually benefited from these schools.
Great. Thank you, Nina. John, I'm going to turn to you. I'm going to ask you a question. How do parents make decisions about school quality? I know some of your research touches on these issues. And are the choices that parents make about sending their kids to schools, is that rational at times or at times irrational? Are there policy fixes that might enable parents to make better choices here?
So by and large, I think it's fair to say that most choices that parents make are rational. Now that's different from saying that families are always requesting and preferring higher performing or higher rated schools. So I've heard in the past folks who work in enrollment offices who express surprise and concern that more families aren't requesting the schools that they think are the very best schools. But that's not the decision that confronts families. If you're choosing a school, you're not just choosing on school quality necessarily, but there are a host of concerns and considerations. So there's a relatively new book by Thomas Stewart and Patrick Wolf that talks about how families choose private schools in Washington, D.C., and they have a nice frame for this, which is thinking about it in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that families will choose safety first. So until you sort of secure your kids' safety, nothing else matters. And then we know from other research that there are a lot of other considerations that come in. And so logistics and convenience matter, which is partly how easy is it to get to the school, and also keeping kids together, keeping siblings together. Academic quality matters, as do other types of quality. So we do see that when families rank schools and they submit requests, they tend to prefer schools that are higher rated and seem to be higher scoring. And then fit matters and programs matter, and there are lots of other things that matter. Having said that, I do think there are places where irrational processes kind of creep in. So some of that arises through information shortcomings, whether that's having incorrect information or insufficient information. And often I think the systems that we have in place for informing families about their options don't speak to a lot of families who are choosing schools for their kids. So for example, families with children who have special needs, it's often very difficult to get information that is relevant and really tells you anything about the options that are available to you from just the booklets and types of things that we put out. Another blind spot, I think, in this is that there is sort of growing evidence that kids are very, very involved in choosing their own high schools. And those are 12 and 13-year-old kids who I've done some work with parents and some work with kids, and parents they talk in ways that I think we would understand, and they respond to information in ways that you would expect. And 12 and 13-year-olds don't, because they're 12 and 13-year-olds. So there's a bit of a blind spot there, I think. As far as policy fixes go, so I'd say there are sort of two buckets. So there's a bucket that has to do with access. So one way of thinking about the sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all of that kind of thing is it would be nice to help parents to put them in a place where they can choose on school quality and really make that what they prioritize. So charter school researchers have spent a lot of time talking about transportation, making sure that families have access to schools across the city, which is good. And being able to get your kid on a bus to the best schools around is a good thing. It's better than not having access. But beyond that, having the best schools around in your neighborhood is sort of a step beyond that. And so both working on sort of bus and transportation policy and in site locations, making sure that there are schools that families want that are right in their neighborhoods. And then safety too, so whatever can be done to make sure that those schools are safe. The second bucket is, to me, information, and I think there's quite a bit more that we can do. So a lot of districts and states are, I think, taking more seriously the questions of what do we have to do to enable people to choose the schools that they want, so to let them know about schools, and that's a really good thing. It is difficult in any way that governments communicate with people to talk to every family, and so I think one potential move that I would like to see is we know families respond very much to what they hear from friends and parents with kids in the school, and districts are in sort of a unique position where they can more rigorously collect information about what people think about schools. So we do a lot of parent surveys in this country, but not always taken seriously, and we don't always make the results very well known. And to the extent that the sort of information sources can get some of this richer, more nuanced information that's more helpful to people, and then also connect families with other families. And there are some nonprofits that are doing some kind of interesting things in getting families an opportunity to speak with other parents who are sort of going through the same type of process.
Great, thank you, John. Nina, I want to turn to you and ask you, what are some innovative or experimental practices that you see in charter schools that we may suspect could end up in traditional district-run schools moving forward? You talked briefly about online and what's happening there. Why don't you tell us a little bit more?
That's a great question. I actually don't think we have done enough research and experimentation in our space to really answer this question the way I would like to answer it. I think we need to double down on the investments we make in research and evaluation at the federal level or at the state level so that we can actually tease out these best practices and share them with the other sector in a consistent way so that it's not just a bunch of case studies that we're sharing. Having said that, the few things that kind of come to mind, one of them includes the work that a few individuals have done around teacher training, teacher recruitment training, Eva Moskowitz in New York comes to mind. Her Success Academy school spends a lot of hours training teachers. So not only does she bring a really bright and devoted and driven teachers, but she also puts a lot of effort in professional development, both pre-service and in-service training. So whatever she's doing deserves to be studied, and something that certainly a lot of other schools can certainly use as well if they think that that model is one that they want to emulate. And mind you, I mean, the results that she's produced in New York are some of the best results in our movement. The other area that I would mention, I mean, the things that's cited the most is our efforts around expanding the school day as a school year, but technology has played a role in innovating in some of our schools. Summit Public Charter Schools in the San Francisco Bay Area and now in Washington State is one example of a school that's really been able to leverage technology to flip the classroom and to really bring learning into the setting by getting students to learn online and then learn and work with the teachers and their peers to take the learning to the next level. So again, we have some examples and some beacons of hope in schools like Summit and Carpe Diem and Rocket Ship and other places, but I think we need to study them much more before we can say with confidence that we can take these models and bring them to scale.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. What do you think, Howard? What are some interesting things happening in charter schools, and where are they going to be moving in the future?
No, I agree with Nina that, you look at some of the things that people have been able to do in some of the new schools that have been created. But the reality of it is, man, you could do that in the traditional system. But what happens is, when I was superintendent, people used to make the argument that these charters should be more like us. You should be making the opposite argument. We ought to be able to have the freedoms in the district that we were given the charter schools, so that we can innovate, so that we can try, different practices. Because, I really marvel at some of the things that I've seen in the schools that I've gone into. I've been inside of charters. I spent 2 years when I was at Brown with Ted Sizer, Dennis Litke, and Debbie Meyer. And all we did was go around and argue about choice, because they used to beat me up about choice, and look at schools. And what I saw were really great things happening, not only in charters, but in traditional schools as well. So I agree with Nina that what we have to be able to do is to show how these best practices that charters have been able to implement actually serve kids well. Because there are really many good ideas. But there are also some ideas in the traditional public school system that charters can use. We're not the only people who have good thoughts about what can happen to kids. And so for me, the issue is, whether you're in a private school, a traditional public school, or a charter school, what are the things that people are doing that really are educating kids well? And how do we make that happen, to scale, or so that larger numbers of kids can in fact benefit by it? And but the reality of it is the politics of this, and we should never leave these discussions and not act like there's a political dimension to this, because there are people who get up every single day with the express purpose of trying to make sure that charters go out of existence. And those of us who've been at this for a while recognize that that struggle has not abated. That the arguments that people are making who are anti-charter schools, in my view, they're getting more intense, not less. Because the longer these efforts exist, the more you call into question that there's only a one best system. And for people whose power is based on maintaining the one best system, they still they're never going to be, I love charter schools, and let's embrace this for the kids. So we're going to have to continue to fight those battles, at least into the future. Now, maybe there's a generation coming that's going to have a totally different view, but I haven't seen it yet. But my hope is that is, in fact, going to happen.
Okay, thank you, Howard. I'm going to ask one final question to each of you briefly before opening it up to audience Q&A. So according to the latest estimates, a little over 3% of school-age children in the U.S. are homeschooled. And as we mentioned at the top of the hour, charter school enrollment is a little over 6.5%. So homeschool is about roughly half the size of the charter school share. So why do we have a lot of attention on charter schools given the relatively small share, or perhaps why not more focused on homeschoolers? So just maybe a quick response from each of you just to respond to that question. John, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. So I think part of it is that there's probably a much lower ceiling on the number of people who are willing to homeschool their kids. I mean, I think often the distinction between charters and traditional public schools is, to parents, it's a legal distinction, it's an administrative distinction. I don't think it much matters. And schools often look pretty similar, charters and traditional public schools. If you step into them, you're still seeing 20, 25 kids in a classroom being taught by a teacher with kind of a standards-based curriculum. Homeschooling is kind of it's a different world. And I think, and I also think to Howard's point just a second ago on where there are folks who are very much opposed to charters, charters present more of a threat to the sort of existing structures. And so some of that is to districts because they present a direct threat to districts through enrollment and funding. Some of it is to teachers' unions. Some of it is to sort of parts of the public through housing value. So there's more attention now going to what happens when you open up public school choice and charters, and suddenly where you live doesn't dictate where your kids go to school, and what does that mean for housing values. So I think charters affect a lot of people much more fundamentally, in part because parents are more willing to consider charters alongside traditional public schools than homeschooling alongside traditional public schools.
Great, thanks. Howard, what do you think?
I don't have anything to add. I have no idea, man. So I don't know.
Nina?
I mean, I'll go back to my point earlier, which is that dollars are leaving the traditional system to come to the charter system in a way that when you're pulling your child out and homeschooling them, there's no direct impact on the space. But I will say a fair number of our schools are also catering to a homeschool community. So about 18,000 charter school students are being taught at home either by their parents or they're in some credit recovery program in high school. So that to some extent is an interesting phenomenon to watch. And I've often wondered why more homeschoolers are not looking at the charter option, because you're getting basically the same services and you don't have to pay for it. So yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nina. And so let's go to audience questions. And as standard, we prefer a question rather than a comment. So why don't I start in the back here? We have a couple of roaming mics. And please stand and give us your name and affiliation, please.
Hi, my name is Kamzi McAdams, and right now I work with TNTP, which is a nonprofit that works on, and I work on academic strategy and on turnaround schools. And I'm really curious to hear your perspective on places where district and charter existence in the same space has actually spurred the kind of innovation that maybe you dreamt of, Dr. Fuller. Because in the places where we work, the charters are sort of like over here, and the district is over here. And they might even be like in the same neighborhood. They might even be on the same block in New York City sometimes. And I don't know whether there are mechanisms for true collaboration, even at the, maybe not at the district level, but even at the teacher to teacher level, because PD schedules are different and opportunities are different. So I just wonder whether you know of any places where that dream that maybe some of us who have been watching this for a long time have been looking for, where it's actually happening, and maybe if you could give it a specific, oh, well, in my district we saw this, so then we implemented this from the charters.
Yeah, I can talk about two places. One is that actually in Milwaukee, there's an organization called Schools That Can Milwaukee that has adopted sort of a 3-sector strategy as it relates to professional development for teachers. And so up underneath all of the politics of it, Schools That Can Milwaukee has been able to bring educators together from private schools, traditional public schools, and charter schools. Because in Milwaukee, we have the voucher program along with independent charters in the traditional district. And that's been interesting to watch, and our school has been a part of that. So it's both the professional development for leaders, school leaders, and for educators. Yesterday I was in Indiana, and there's this new law that's been passed in Indiana that allows for innovative schools like within the district. And so I was in a visioning meeting between the district, Mind Trust, and the mayor's office, because the mayor has the authorizing authority there. And there's an example of where they're trying to figure out how do we actually work together to try to really create quality schools for kids. So that's, those are 2 examples that I'm aware of.
I will just say that this is actually an opportunity for the 2 sectors to come together, and those places that have succeeded at this are Denver, the Denver School District, Spring Branch, although the superintendent left recently, but it takes really often the superintendent of the traditional system to recognize and invite the charter community to the table, because to the extent you just have a few charter schools in the mix, they by themselves don't have a leader who can then broker these meetings and come up with ways to collaborate. And most educators are not waking up every day thinking, how can I go collaborate with the school next door? They're just thinking about, what am I going to do in this classroom on this very day? So it takes someone in a central office to pull these things together. And I wish more district superintendents would take a look at what Denver has done and replicate that.
Great, thank you. Let's go to another question up here.
My name is David North. I'm with the Center for Immigration Studies, a lesser think tank down the road. My question is, how does the panel react to a phenomenon I'm about to mention in about 100 words? And that phenomenon is the Gulen schools. That's Gulen. They're named for Muhammad F. Gulen, who was a cleric in exile, self-imposed exile in Pennsylvania. And his schools tend to recruit overseas through the H-1B program, foreign workers, bringing in, among other things, English teachers from Turkey to teach English in these schools, which are dominated by the local Turkish-American community. And this has obviously been hard on American, let's say, permanent resident alien citizens, teachers, who would like to have those jobs, but they're being displaced by people brought in sort of extraneously from Turkey. And I wondered if the panel has any comments on that.
Nina, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I'm not aware of any Gulen schools in the U.S. There are a few chains, charter school chains, that are led by Turkish Americans, and to the extent they've succeeded at bringing trained teachers from other countries who have subject matter mastery in physics and chemistry and are willing to work in the traditional system or in the charter school system, I think that's a good thing. Some of these networks, especially Harmony in Texas, boast huge academic achievement outcomes. If you walk into these schools, you'd be hard-pressed to say that these schools are not serving the needs of the community. So all I know is what I've seen in some of these schools, and I think they're doing a fine job. I don't know of any connections to Gulen and what you're talking about, though.
There is such a, there are formal network.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Right there in the back here. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Josh Glazer from George Washington University. I have a question for Dr. Fuller. Happy to hear from the other panelists as well. I've heard you say in the past and appreciated your point that charter schools give choice to poor people who would otherwise not have that choice. And that was a powerful point. I'm wondering, though, now that there's more experience and more research, such as the events in New Orleans, where some 7,000 people, largely African American, lost their jobs. The events in Memphis, where you have the state-run accelerated school district, achievement school district, where there's been a lot of community pushback, again, largely from, almost predominantly from African American communities there, neighborhoods. And you have research that shows moderate to small effects of charters. And you have other research which suggests that charters increase segregation. And I know this sounds like an anti-charter statement, but I don't mean it that way. I'm just wondering, given your earlier statements and the importance of your voice here on this stage, have these events and research given you pause or led you to rethink or recalibrate some of your earlier sort of more unequivocal support for charters?
Josh, don't you follow me on Twitter, man? I think you do. Okay, so let me be really clear. I am an unequivocal supporter of charter schools and the chartering process, right? But I have to be intellectually honest, with myself about what some of the downsides have been. Like, I've never seen a public policy that only has an upside. I think every public policy has an upside or downside. And at the point in history in which you live, you're trying to determine whether or not the upside outweighs the downside. In my view, the upside for charters outweigh the downside. But there have been issues. And it hasn't just been charters, it's the broader ed reform movement. So for example, if you read Michelle Foster's book, Black Teachers Talk About Teaching, and she interviews teachers, she calls them elders, veterans, novices. And the elders are like this one black woman who had been teaching in South Carolina for 60 years. And so what they talk about in this book is what happened when integration came. When integration came, black schools got closed, black teachers lost their jobs, black teachers' opinions were devalued. What happened with ed reform? Black schools got closed, black teachers lost their jobs, black teachers' ideas were devalued. That's real. So when you look at the New Orleans situation, 4,300 of those people were teachers, so roughly, I guess Doug would say. I think it's somewhere around in there, right? And I would say about 90% of those people were black people. Too high, 80? Two-thirds. What that meant was an impact on the middle class in New Orleans. So if you think about what's happening in economic terms in the black community, some of what we've done, which do serve the interests of kids, it also has a downside in terms of its impact on the economics of the community. We can't act like that isn't true. But what we have to do is we have to say, ultimately, were the kids better served by these decisions? But we also need to ask ourselves, could there have been a different decision made? And I would argue, and people would push back on me, that we could have made different decisions in New Orleans. The reason why we didn't make different decisions was who was in the room when the decisions were made. And that's what I'm trying to argue, is that many times the people in the room who make these decisions are white people. And they don't stop and think, well, what is going to be the impact of this on the black community. That's my argument, Josh. And so, but that is not an argument against charters. That is not to act like a lot of kids are not better off in New Orleans because of what happened. They are. But a lot of kids are not. And then there are the larger issues of what happened over and above just having to do with schooling. Those are the concerns that I have. But that should not be interpreted as I somehow have rethought my support for charters. Does it make sense? I mean,
Great. Thank you. You got a question up here, Jane?
Charter schools are public schools. Charter schools are public schools. They get taxpayers' money, and they serve children. Now, those set of conditions seem to call for regulation. And if you look across the states, there's tremendous variation in regulation. And I'm just wondering what each of you think should be the policies surrounding regulation of charter schools.
So we're running out of time, so let's do a lightning response if you can. So
It's a great question. One of the things that our movement has taken very seriously as of late certainly is the importance of closing poor-performing schools. I believe 270 schools closed last year for a variety of reasons, but quality is certainly one of them. This is kind of an ongoing question. I think we need to have a longer discussion, and I don't know if I can answer it very quickly, but we do a report at the National Alliance that looks at the health of the charter school movement, looking at indicators of quality, innovation, and scale. And Washington, D.C. is an example of a district that comes to the top every year. And I think looking at what D.C. has done, how they've done it, and how they've walked the line between increasing the number of charters, serving the needs of the community, and coming up with a frame that attracts leaders to start charter schools is the right place to start.
thank you. Howard, John, have you anything to add?
So similar thoughts on being thoughtful about when and how to close schools. And then just a little bit tangential, but I think there's also, it is an interesting phenomenon of charters that there has been a lot of autonomy for the means for how schools operate, but we've been pretty clear on the ends in that it's state accountability systems and researchers, we all sort of talk about the same things as far as what schools should be doing, and I think there's sort of a de facto regulation that happens there. And so there was some discussion about the variation in schools and school programs, and I think some of it actually gets constrained by the fact that we're pretty particular about about what we ultimately hold schools accountable for, that although not regulation, I think in a way has some similar kinds of effects.
I would just say that I've always been intrigued by the fact that a lot of the accountability soldiers for charter schools have never wanted to have that battle take place for the traditional school district. And so if we're going to talk about accountability, let's talk about it. And then let's talk about it for everybody.
Well, great. Well, thank you. Thank you for this very stimulating conversation. And please join me in thanking the panelists for their presentation.